If you close your eyes and picture the American West, Hollywood has trained you to see a very specific image. You see the golden hour sun hitting the red rocks of Monument Valley. You see a stoic hero, clean-shaven, riding a well-fed horse into a town where justice is dispensed by a tin star and a fast draw. We call this the romance of the frontier. But if we could transport you back to 1870, the first thing that would hit you is not the adventure. It is the smell. The real West did not smell like freedom. It smelled of dysentery, unwashed bodies, rotting livestock, and open latrines. The reality of the frontier was an assault on the senses and a siege on the human body. The greatest killer in the West was not the outlaw with a Colt revolver. It was the microscopic bacteria in a glass of water. We have been sold a lie. A billion-dollar industry was built on the idea that the West was a place of glory, where a man could carve out his destiny with grit and gunpowder. But open the diaries of the women who crossed the plains. Read the surgical reports of the frontier army doctors. The truth is far more terrifying. The West was not a playground for heroes. It was a graveyard for the unprepared. It was a place where a simple tooth infection meant a slow, agonizing death. It was a place where survival didn't mean winning a gunfight. It meant living through a winter where the snow was 6 feet deep and your food reserves were gone. Today, we strip away the Technicolor paint. We are going to look at the fear, the blood, and the brutal reality of survival that the movies never had the courage to show you. To understand the true nature of this era, we must look at the stage upon which it was played. The vast expanse between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean was not a landscape of opportunity for the weak. It was a biological gauntlet. Between 1840 and 1869, approximately 350,000 to 500,000 migrants took to the trails. The Oregon, the California, the Mormon. Cinema portrays these wagon trains as adventurous road trips, interrupted occasionally by a dramatic Indian attack. The statistical reality is starkly different. Historians estimate that there are 10 graves for every single mile of the Oregon Trail. 10 bodies every mile for 2,000 miles, and very few of them died from violence. The Great Reaper was cholera. It struck with terrifying speed. A man could be healthy at breakfast, driving his oxen, and dead by sunset, his body completely dehydrated, his skin turned blue. There was no medicine. Families had to make the brutal decision to bury their loved ones in shallow graves, often dug up by wolves hours later, and keep moving, or risk the entire party dying of exposure in the coming winter. The trail was lined with discarded furniture, heirlooms, and eventually, the bones of those who couldn't keep up. Furthermore, consider the crushing economics. In the movies, everyone has a horse and a gun. In reality, a good horse cost anywhere from $50 to $150 in 1870. The average cowboy earned $25 a month. To lose a horse was financial ruin. A Colt peacemaker cost $17, almost a month's wages. Most settlers walked. They walked 2,000 miles next to their wagons because the animals were too valuable to ride. The poverty was grinding. Men didn't fight over honor, they fought over a stolen pair of boots because boots meant you could work, and work meant you didn't starve. If the landscape was the stage, the cowboy was the supposed hero. No figure has been more distorted by fiction. We imagine the cowboy as a knight of the plains, a freelance agent of justice roaming from town to town. Here is the reality. The cowboy was a low-wage, overworked, seasonal laborer. He was not independent. He was a corporate employee, often working for massive cattle syndicates owned by investors in London or New York who had never even seen a cow. The mistake that cost many young men their lives was believing the romance of the cattle drive. They signed up for what they thought was adventure only to find a death march. A trail drive from Texas to Kansas lasted months. It was 18 hours a day in the saddle, choking on the dust of 2,000 steers. The danger wasn't a shootout. The danger was the stampede. A clap of thunder or a spooked horse could send tons of beef panic-stricken into the dark. If you were in front of it, you were turned into paste. If you fell off your horse, you were gone. And then there was the river crossing. This was the terror of the trail drive. Forcing a herd across the Red River or the Arkansas River when the waters were high was a suicide mission. Dozens of cowboys drowned every season, pulled under by the current or crushed by swimming cattle. They didn't die with boots on in a duel. They died gasping for air in muddy water. Their bodies often never recovered. And let's address the gunfight. The iconic high noon standoff is a statistical anomaly invented by dime novelists. The cowboy of the 1870s carried a gun to shoot rattlesnakes or put down a horse with a broken leg. Ammunition was expensive and of poor quality. When violence did occur, it wasn't at 50 paces. It was at 3 feet. It was messy, fueled by cheap whiskey and exhaustion. It involved knives, broken bottles, and shooting men in the back. There was no fair play. If a man wanted you dead, he waited until you were asleep or drunk. The fast draw is a myth. Accuracy was impossible with the sights filed down. You survived by being ruthless, not by being fast. Consider the medical reality. If you were shot in the limb, the bullet wasn't the problem, the infection was. Without antibiotics, a simple wound became gangrenous within days. The treatment? Amputation. Performed often on a kitchen table with whiskey as the only anesthetic. The sawbones doctors were often untrained, reusing unwashed instruments from patient to patient, spreading sepsis like wildfire. But there is another hidden population, the women. Hollywood shows us the saloon girl with a heart of gold, beautiful and witty. The historical term was soiled dove, and their reality was a nightmare of exploitation. These women were not liberated entrepreneurs. Many were destitute war widows or orphans, trafficked into mining camps where men outnumbered women 50 to 1. Suicide rates among these women were astronomically high, often via laudanum or morphine overdoses. And for the homestead wives, the enemy was silence. It was called Prairie Madness. Imagine the wind on the Great Plains. It never stops. It blows incessantly day and night. For women left alone in sod houses, dark burrows made of dirt, while husbands were away, the isolation shattered the mind. Diaries from the 1880s describe a crushing depression. Women would stare at the horizon for hours until they snapped. There are police reports of mothers killing their children to save them from the harshness of the life, driven, insane by the solitude. This psychological toll is the dark underbelly of the pioneer spirit. We must look at the tragedy of the Donner Party not just as a horror story of cannibalism, but as the ultimate example of the survival at all costs mentality. In the winter of 1846, trapped in the Sierra Nevada, social norms evaporated. Civilization is a thin veneer. When the hunger became absolute, the glory of the pioneer spirit was replaced by the primal need to eat. Those who survived carried a trauma that defined the rest of their lives. But even for the average settler, the consequences of life in the West were severe. The aging process accelerated rapidly. A man of 40 often looked 70. The sun leathers the skin. The malnutrition bows the bones. We also see the social consequences in the violence that permeated society. The West was populated by a generation of men traumatized by the Civil War. They carried what was then called soldier's heart, what we now know as PTSD. They moved west to escape, but they brought their demons with them. This explains the erratic, explosive violence of legends like John Wesley Hardin or Clay Allison. These were not cool-headed duelists. They were damaged, unstable men who used the lack of law enforcement to act out their trauma. Hardin killed over 40 men, not out of justice, but out of a pathological need to dominate fueled by war trauma. To survive the West often meant losing your moral compass. It meant doing things, killing, stealing, abandoning the weak, that civilized society deemed unforgivable. The survivors weren't the heroes with the white hats. The survivors were often the ones willing to be the most ruthless. We look back at the Old West with nostalgia, because we are safe. We watch the movies from the comfort of climate-controlled rooms, with refrigerators full of food and antibiotics in the cabinet. It is easy to worship the freedom of the frontier when you don't have to smell the sickness or feel the gnawing hunger in your belly. The men and women who walked that ground did not see themselves as legends. They saw themselves as people trying to endure one more day without dying of infection, exposure, or starvation. The West was not one with a shiny Colt revolver. It was one with blood, bile, and a tolerance for suffering that the modern world has forgotten. It was a place where fear was the constant companion, and glory was just a story told to sell dime novels to people back east. When you look at those old grainy photographs, don't look for the hero. Look for the exhaustion in their eyes. That is the only true history of the American West.